There are times in life when you accept yourself as being very, very lucky. One of them is when you're a naval historian who runs a YouTube channel, as well as being a uni lecturer, and you get to indulge parts of your passions for things as well as history to highlight history. In this case, I'm going with the Glourious Heritage class of the Andromeda series. Now, why do I bring up the GHCs? Well, and this is going to sound very strange, but it's pertinent. I actually use this class quite often when I'm teaching strategy, especially when I'm teaching something called strategic deterrence and nuclear deterrence. Why do I bring them up? Well, because this class are the high point of the High Guard, the fleet that protects the system's Commonwealth, which we're talking about. And yet they have systems which, although classified as strategic deterrent, they are never used. In fact, there's no doctrine for their use. There's no practice of their use, which means they have no real justification. And it means that other powers, and this actually features in the fall of the Commonwealth, have no belief that they would be used. So instead of them being symbols of how powerful this ship is and this class is, despite the fact they are incredibly powerful without these weapons, they become a symbol for how weak the government is, because they have these powerful things and they choose not to use them. They are not able to use them, or rather, they have no policy, it seems, of using them. So they are just adornments. The Systems Commonwealth is a rather interesting creation, and it is partially Gene Roddenberry, but I have always been tempted to suggest that the Star Trek model of the United Federation of Planets is the United States gone to space. To my mind, the Commonwealth, and this might be because of the name I'm seeing it as, but it's a constitutional monarchy with a representative parliament. That sounds kind of like the UK going to space, doesn't it? Let's be honest. And it's a constitutional monarchy because it's born out of an empire which first ruled a huge amount of space, and then realizing that they were the minority in their empire, and to preserve stability and peace and to keep a hefty control over that empire, they slowly change into a democratic federation, which is a constitutional monarchy. Where have I heard that story before? The first Commonwealth must have been doing something quite right, because it lasted for 5,500 years. Unfortunately, it ends in a violent civil war. This civil war comes about because of losses sustained and a treaty having to be achieved with Magog, who had attacked the Commonwealth. And the trouble is, for much of those 5,500 years, there hadn't really been a lot of fighting. In fact, one of the ships which we were talking about at one point will be called 12 centuries, because there's 12 centuries of peace. 1,200 years with no battles. You'd have to have some pretty realistic exercises and be prepared to accept some pretty embarrassing things in order to keep your fleet at full fighting pitch for that time. It's very easy in times of peace to forget that all humiliation, pain, and expense in peacetime can save lives in wartime, especially when you have to worry about the Monday morning papers or the 24-hour news cycle and the constant talking heads and the armchair admirals on social media blasting you. It's very easy to forget that and think, I just want a quiet life and I want to do the best I can without having to deal with all that nightmare. I often get asked the question, how does the Royal Navy deal with that when they start preparing for World War One and into the interwar years? Why? They have all these press and all these things growing, they have radio, etc. How do they manage it? Honestly, they don't. They outsource the management of it to the to the Navy League, which is a body of service personnel, but also retired personnel and academics and politicians who support them and various other things who basically exist to inform. And they will not shut up about the reasons you do these things. And that's an interesting organization to think about. A purpose which is not to be political, not to always defend the Navy, not to always claim the Navy's correct, but something which exists to constantly explain to the Navy what the politicians are saying and explain to the politicians and the public what the Navy is doing and why these things matter. The Systems Commonwealth, all Systems Commonwealth, the Commonwealth, whatever which particular alias you like of it, didn't seem to have that sort of organization. But there again, to an extent, it didn't need it in a way, because at its core were the veterans, a quadruped race, who have a very warlike past, but certainly have moved beyond that. Anyway, the High Guard. And I've taken some of these things directly from the website, the New Systems Commonwealth Wiki, because, frankly, they're the experts. And so here is the quote from the High Guard's description of their task of the High Guard. High Guard is strongly involved in representing the Commonwealth in both internal and external affairs, such as first contact, wars, and humanitarian missions. Okay, that's all pretty much the cruising role, and what I expect any space warship to have to deal with quite a lot in the future. Because of that, the High Guard's entire appearance is designed to express the power and glory of the Systems Commonwealth. Oh my god, this sounds like presents missions being ripped over, but also explains some design stylistics. Thus, Commonwealth starships are designed to be an awe-inspiring representation of strength, dignity, and prosperity. Ooh, I'm liking it, but we'll be looking at this class soon. Being a military force, the main assignment of the High Guard was, of course, to maintain peace. For example, by keeping an eye on the Caldearans, who had been an original empire and opponent of the Veterans when they'd been an empire, let alone, whilst they were members of the Systems Commonwealth, were never exactly its most happy members, and secure the borders whilst also undertaking research expeditions. For these purposes, the High Guard ships were equipped with highly effective sensor arrays and weapons, the ultimate being the Nova Bomb. The fact that actually using the Nova Bomb was not part of military doctrine, and the fact that fact not being a secret, made the Nietzschean Rebellion much easier. Nietzschean Rebellion is what comes up after the Magog. Basically, Nietzscheans are a genetically engineered offshoot of humanity, who are achieving perfection through genetic engineering in their aim to exist in the harshest of environments. And they are upset after the Magog War of the Peace Treaty, which basically gives a lot of territories which had been theirs to the Magog, because the High Guard at that point is not strong enough to push back the Magog, because the Magog are a species who basically attack sedate any live personnel they manage to come across, civilian or military, and lay their eggs in them, and those hatch out. It's a very interesting species to deal with, but it does mean that they tend to not worry too much about losses and come on in mass. So despite the fact the High Guard, I would argue, were definitely technically and tactically often superior, sheer overwhelming numbers. And that's another problem with the High Guard. They do have a strong pursuit of the high tech. Now, the High Guard are an interesting organization. They are well trained. You have to do at least a year as an enlisted in the Home Guard, which is, and every sort of planet civilization has their own sort of Home Guard and version of the, I think, US National Guard structure. You have to do a year as enlisted in that, then at least a year as an officer before you can apply to the High Guard for training to join the High Guard. So you're already 10% experience before you can join the High Guard, and then you have to be good to actually qualify and get through to the High Guard itself. So you're going to be good. But it's also a problem in getting into it. The High Guard has so many missions, and it's a powerful fleet, and it does have the purpose of having its ships looking individually powerful so they can have the most dramatic impact they can. But you have this weapon, and this is the first thing that always strikes me whenever talking about this: the Nova Bomb. Okay, well, if you have the Nova Bomb as an ultimate weapon, but you don't want to have a doctrine for using it, then don't deploy it on your ships. Say, we've kept it away. It's sitting in an admiral's locker, or it's only on an admiral's flagship, not on any other ships. And it's not as if your conventional forces aren't already powerful. Most of your battle forces are built around heavy cruiser battle groups, which have a heavy cruiser, often a Glourious Heritage class, sometimes a slightly older class, but usually Glourious Heritage. Usually Glourious Heritage. 4 deep standoff attack ships, which I always consider sort of destroyers in their approach. They are designed to be as minimally crewed as possible, and they come from, well, Fingers of Dawn are the other class of cruisers, which sometimes form the core cruiser. But the deep standoff attack ships, they're basically missile farms. Think of them as arsenal ships or destroyers from sort of the 1920s, 1930s. Minimal defensive weaponry, maximum offensive weaponry. They're designed to appear out of slipstream, which is their method of fast night travel. Blast off missiles. Just keep raining missiles on the enemy and disappear. Present as narrow a profile to the opponent as possible so that it's hard to see as possible. And then you have a whole group of defense frigates and long-range surveillance ships to do the targeting and supply maintenance ships to spawn. This is a full-on battle group. It's got logistics, it's got reconnaissance and targeting, it's got escort, it's got strike, it's got command. Everything in there is what's needed. The High Guard's fleet itself is split over 3 galaxies, and each galaxy is sort of tailored, but the heavy battle groups are the core of this. There were just over 360,000 ships in the High Guard when the Commonwealth, the first one, fell. 150,000 of those are dedicated combat exploration platforms. The remaining 210,000 were long-range logistics support ships and scientific roles and cargo ships and ferrying, all sorts of duties. This is a very dedicated and organized formation. You could argue that there's too much tail to too little dog, but honestly, if you're talking about logistics across 3 galaxies, I'd say the fact that they have a ratio of roughly 3-2, pretty darn amazing. In fact, it's better than 3-2, because technically 3-2 would be 120 to 210 to 140,000. And these ships, especially the standoff attack ships, they are very, very cool in terms of their firepower. I would add, though, one of the things I find interesting about them is that there's basically there's 2 classes of them. Most of them are the righteous first fist of heaven class, and then there's later siege perilous class. This is what I have this one. Interesting enough, they only have 2 classes. This is the class which they come with after the Magog. After the Magog attack, they start to produce these, and they only actually have 3 completed before there's the rebellion. This speaks to me of a pace. Very slow to change. There's a lot of technology upgrades being incorporated into it, but it's the same hull coming through. And at a certain point, you have to look at them and go, why is it the same hull? Why are you not upgrading? Why are you not improving? Because surely you can make it better. So it seems important to cover the whole role of deterrence and why I keep going on about it in terms of heavy weapons in this video. It's been pointed out to me, especially by reviewer 2. I sent it off to 2 very kind people to review. Mia Kimura, thank you very much for your very kind words and the information you've given me, and you're going to see that it's going to be added in. You're going to see the Poodle Avengers shirt again a couple of times in this video. And the other one it went off to was I was very cheeky. I've mentioned Glyn Stewart before. I've mentioned his books. I did a book review and based on one of his books, and very kindly responded to me on Twitter, and we're chatting away, and I found out he liked the Andromeda series, so I asked him to watch this a bit. And he came back to me and said he agreed, which was very, very nice for a lot of what I was saying. Not everything, of course, but we're humans. But what he said was, one of the things that came from was that the deterrence needed to have a more distinct section talking about it, and deterrence as a factor. There are 3 types of deterrence. There is tactical deterrence, there is strategic deterrence, and there is geostrategic deterrence in terms of how we think about it these days on Earth. Basically, geostrategic deterrence would be nuclear weapons. It is massive amounts of firepower. In this universe, we're talking about the Nova bomb and the negative energy bomb. These weapons are supreme. Having them is a status symbol for a spacefaring alliance. They are overwhelmingly powerful. And if you have a theoretical willingness to use them, or at least a doctrine which explains and proves that, and gives you a line of reasoning for which they might be used, then that provides a ceiling beyond which conflict can't go. So basically, if you're saying if this is going to fall to, let's say we're talking about Britain on Earth, we'd be talking about a level of, if you are conquering the UK and you're using nuclear weapons to do it, Britain will probably respond in kind with her nuclear weapons. Because you're going basically it's saying, if you nuke us, we'll nuke you, so don't nuke us and keep things conventional. It's similar in space, in that you said, if you make it so that this planetary system is of no longer any viable use for us, and you have made it so that there is no chance of us recovering our citizenry, because you are not following the codes of war which we have established, who might be caught here, we will glass this system. Because that will destroy any forces you have in there, which you will still have in there, because you'll be occupying the system, and you'll lose all your forces, and therefore, render the system uninhabitable for you. Uninhabitable for anyone. It's a big thing, but you have these weapons and you're fitting them on ships. So you've got a weapon which can do that, but you're then not. You've got a rules, which I'll talk about in other parts of this video about how to use it, but you haven't got use it now. You haven't actually said when you can use it. You've got rules about its use in terms of structures of the structures and command protocols that need to be followed to use it, but at no point have you got a codified system of saying this is when this is justified. Then you go down that and you go, right, so what's strategic deterrence? If that's geostrategic deterrence, what is strategic deterrence? And strategic deterrence is usually conventional weapons, but overwhelming conventional firepower. I.e., we have a vast armada of warships, aircraft, artillery, and we will grid square you with conventional weaponry. We will literally divide your country up into grid squares, and every single square will be pummeled with something. That is strategic deterrence. You attack us, we'll do that to you. We attack you, you do that to us. And that's also can be used. Both of those can be the nuclear weapons between nuclear powers, equivalent powers, are a ceiling. You can't really use those to bully people on the table these days in modern modern Earth politics, and you can understand why perhaps Nova bombs you don't want to use to bully people anyway. In terms of that sort of level, because if you are deploying them and then don't want to deploy them because of the damage they'll do, then you have trouble. But this is conventional weaponry. So the equivalent is the firepower which Andromeda and the Glourious Heritage class has in terms of their conventional missiles, the fact that they are able to depopulate a planet in a few minutes. Again, I'll get into some more detail later. All those add to that. Which is interesting. And then tactical deterrence. Now, what is tactical deterrence? It's something which is an interesting point to put out when you're talking about naval diplomacy, potential space diplomacy, and maritime warfare, but also land warfare. You have three options when you're doing naval diplomacy. You either turn up with equivalent firepower, i.e. a meeting of equals. You turn up with inferior firepower, i.e. a meeting of superiors, because you choose to bring inferior firepower. You have a lot more. You have equivalents, and you have, but you basically don't create. You're basically going, yeah. You need a big ship to try and even match our presence. All we have to send is a little ship. It's a calculated insult that they can't do anything about, because if they do, they look like they're cowards and wusses. Or you turn up with overwhelming firepower. Now, interestingly enough, you could classify the deployment of Nova weapons on high guard ships as the latter for naval diplomacy. For space diplomacy, they turn up with potential overwhelming firepower. The trouble is, that means people know about it, and because you have to tell them they're on there, so that people know about so that people know that they're potentially, because they're not like, it's not like a gun cruiser where you can see the massive, great big guns. They can stare at you. It's the missile is buried inside the warship that can be deployed out of a launcher, the same other missiles. But it's a lot of so it's the case you have it, but it undermines itself when you don't have the doctrine for when it'll be used. It kind of doesn't work. It would be like turning up with an 8-inch cruiser, a cruiser with 8-inch guns, and having, I don't know, construction tape around them and signs saying out of order, or you get the mess, you get the idea. It's basically it's taking something which should be a potent symbol of your strength and power as a star-faring civilization and turning into a laughter point. Which is another reason why the Glorious Heritage class specifically is interesting to me, because, well, they aren't the only ones. Prior to them, there were the Fingers of Dawn class, which look sort of similar. They're not as good as the Glorious Heritage, but they are good. The Glorious Heritage class themselves are mostly built at Newport News orbital shipyards above Earth. They are 1,301 meters long. They have a beam of 976 meters. Now, what's described as a draft of 325 meters, but this might sound strange, but I'm guessing that's height, because I don't think they're supposed to go into water. A mass of 96,408,876 kilograms, or 96.4 thousand tons, roughly. Crew complement. At fully crewed, they could have up to 4,132 crew aboard and 800 lancers. Plus, they could take 2,000 odd passengers if they wanted to. These are huge ships. But they could also be crewed by a lot less. Now, some figures put it down to 6, but if we consider certain scenarios, it seems to be that at points, captains have been quite happy to crew them with as little as 2, or leave pretty much no crew aboard. They need at least one human pilot, one human, or when I say human, they need at least one organic pilot aboard to fly them into slipstream. It seems to be that artificial intelligence aren't as good at navigating in the slipstream space as organics. So theoretically, you could probably get away with 1 or 2 crew. 6 sounds like a good basic number. They do this because they have a huge number of droids aboard, and because of things as being incredibly automated. And actually, that's a good idea. Having a ship which can take thousands of crew and to be fully run and is fine and is useful, because there are times when you would want all that crew aboard. Damage control, the capability to offload personnel onto planets if you need them, to manage all those systems, to distribute the fighters and have them be crewed and under organic control, all makes sense. And she does carry a versatile air group, 36 RF-42 Central tactical fighters, 76 RA-26 Shrike strike fighters, 12 AF-A-29 Phoenix atmospheric attack craft, 16 ES-1115 Oracle heavy sensor attack drones, 8 ES-14 Janus light sensory attack drones. All of those can be optionally crewed, other than the drones, which are completely uncrewed. She also has a huge number of planetfall defense bots. At least 2 of the larger type tend to be carried, but there are some reports they're able to carry up to 4. And approximately, it seems, up to 800, if not 1,000, of the smaller planetary defense bots. So, all in all, this is not a ship you want to fight. This is the center of a task group. Now, it doesn't carry as many missiles as one of the great big deep standoff attack ships does. But that's because it exchanges some of those missiles for a fighter group, it exchanges some of those missiles for its command role, and exchanges some of those missiles for defensive weapons, so it can get in closer. It's got to do the first contact missions. It's got to do the protect those standoff attack ships, because those standoff attack ships, as great as they are, if you get close enough with a tough enough ship, things have gone really wrong, and that's where the Glourious Heritage class comes into its own, to protect those. So what she's armed with? Well, she has 200 electronic magnetic launch system missile launch tubes. They're capable of firing OM-5 standard defensive kinetic kill missiles, DM-5 standard defensive kinetic kill missiles, PM-6 Star Arrow smart anti-ship missiles, PM-6L strategic Star Arrow smart anti-ship missiles, the extended range variant, PM-6L2 strategic Star Arrow Mark 5 variant, and the Sapper 6 III Strike Arrow surface attack variant, plus Nova bombs and negative energy bombs. If you think Nova bomb is bad in terms of utility, negative energy bomb seems to be even more restrictive in their use. Again, you have taken up space, you have publicly fitted, you have declared you're fitting these 2 super powerful weapons to this ship. And then you have A, no doctrine for their use, B, no intention of creating the doctrine for their use, and C, everyone knows you don't. A deterrent is only useful if people think you will use it, because otherwise it's no longer a deterrent, it's a joke, which undermines you. These are powerful, powerful ships. Slipstream to allow them to go fast and light, and computer systems which are based around artificial intelligence. They are really very, very capable. They're also portentously named, let's be honest. It's named for the glorious heritage of peace and stability of the system's Commonwealth. We're never sure if there is actually a cruiser itself called Glorious Heritage. But considering some of the other names they have for cruiser, they've come up with these cruisers, and the sheer number they must have had, if you're thinking again, 150,000 combat ships, and you go through that sort of the attack group, and you think, how many are in here? Let's see, we've got roughly 34 vessels in each attack group. There's gonna be a lot of cruisers. You're talking several hundred, which is another thing which makes some of the whole Nietzschean war and rebellion kind of difficult to believe until you're considering the scale of it. But there had to be several hundred of these. There had to be. that your attack groups, yes, you're going to have, not all your ships are going to be formed into your heavy cruiser battle groups. You have got planetary drop groups as well, which have to be factored into numbers. But 150,000, let's say you have 1,000 of these groups over there, that's only 30,000 ships assigned to them. 34,000 ships. And that's 1,000 heavy cruisers there. 34,000 of 150,000 is not me sounding excessive. So there's a lot of these cruisers. They're building a lot of them. That's possibly another reason for the fact that they don't introduce many new types. They don't seem to introduce a new type that regularly. But there again, you are spread across 3 galaxies, trying to defend 3 galaxies. I know you called the shipyards are called the Newport News, but I hope they can build a little bit faster. Newport News is kept on a slow go. Not, you know, I would have hoped a planetary society, interplanetary society spanning all this way would be able to go, you know what, we need to actually build a little bit quicker than this. And yes, you also have to remember that the High Guard number of ships do not actually include all the ships the High Guard can control, because those are just the ships the High Guard has themselves. They don't include the militia strength, which are for every Home Guard. That's life. Anyway, so what of this class members do we know? Because you consider there's about 1,000. The fact that the ones we know of are very few. We know of Pax Angelic. She seems to have had an interesting career. Pax Angelic is considered to be the eldest of all the Glorious Heritage class warships and supposed to be the first, which suggests there isn't a cruiser itself called Glorious Heritage. But then why aren't they called the Pax Angelic class? Okay, yes, we can decide that the Empire, the Commonwealth has its own particular naming strategies, but I sometimes think of that as, if you've got all these ships coming from one shipyard, that would be strange. So it might be that the reality is, despite, and would fit in with the lines of discussion, that Pax Angelic might have been the first to come from the Earth shipyard of Newport News for the Milky Way galaxy, and the others, Glorious Heritage, might have been built in another galaxy. Or Glorious Heritage herself isn't considered the first of the class proper, because she's the ship which was built first to test all the technologies, and then they build the class. We don't know. She actually survives the fall of the system of Commonwealth, and she survives because she, to an extent, disobeys orders. She's told to blow herself up because she's carrying so much vital intelligence. But the trouble was, and this is a small issue of artificial intelligence you have to consider it, if you've got it sufficiently advanced, it had formed a relationship with the captain, perhaps against regulations, a deeply romantic one, and it couldn't understand that its commanding, the person it loved, was telling it to blow itself up. So instead it released its slipstream score, which blew everyone else up, but it managed to get away using its sublight drives. She's a powerful ship, and thanks to the abilities of these ships, and due to their size and space, to be able to basically build everything they need themselves. They can create their own fuel, they can create their own weapon systems. Well, they can build, they can manufacture them. She actually survives for 300 years and without ships being able to take her over. And look at her, she's gold. She's glorious in her beauty. And she, unsurprisingly, creates a sort of myth around her. But she is a very powerful presence in the in her area of space. Eventually, she has to be destroyed by the Andromeda Ascendant herself, but leave that to one side. Million Voices, another powerful-looking vessel, and if you're starting to notice something, hang on, Alex. So far, you've shown us 3 ships of this class. They've all looked slightly different. Yeah, this is another reason why I think that this is another reason for, I think, the slow construction. Everyone seems to be slightly different than the others. They all seem to be 20% personalized. And I can understand that. Stylization of these things is nice. It adds to the impact. But I don't know. Perhaps the Systems Commonwealth needs to learn this phrase, standardization. Although they seem to have worked out on the systems inside the ships. So perhaps they're just external, they decide to play around with things. Million Voices was captured by the Dragov Katsov Pride during the rebellion, and she refused to serve them. They were kept prisoners by the Nitchins. She was hijacked in her dry dock, basically, by them. And once in the Tartarus system, she'd increased her artificial gravity fields and crushed them all. However, getting there, once they got there, the Nitchins had managed to maroon her and 50 other High Guard ships in the system. They hoped to take over the ships, but this is another advantage of the lovely artificial intelligence. They managed to prove too strong for the Nitchins to actually take them over. Eventually, she'll sacrifice herself to try and get the other ships free. Pretty brave ship. Her armor complement is listed as 4,000 general utility android units and 2 planet defense bot, plus multi-purpose shipboard robots and a self-guided recording unit. Always nice. The general utility androids do appear to be all over these ships, and they are critical to their ability to actually work. Because that means that these ships can work with a very, very small crew. A very small crew. But, yeah, it just seems such a waste. Then we have the Lancer's Hope, which is another one we know of. Now, the Lancer's Hope we know of because she was destroyed by a Nitchin fleet around Almagast. Apparently. We don't know 100% sure whether this is the case, because basically a pilot contacts Andromeda and her captain and tells them tells what's happened. They go to investigate. When they arrive around the planet, there's no sign of wreckage or anything of the vessel in orbit. So it may have been destroyed there. It may have been destroyed in another place. It might have survived. Interesting enough, it is one of the ones which looks the closest to Andromeda in styling. The Midian Breach. Now, if you want a good example of something being absolutely wasted, it's the Midian Breach. Now, why am I talking about the Midian Breach being wasted? Well, because this is a Glourious Heritage class vessel, a full-on cruiser, which has been left adrift by a faction who are remnants of the system Commonwealth, known as collectors, who are a branch of their library, and they've used it as a prison ship, and they've used it to basically as a test to try and destroy Dylan Hunt, who's the captain of Andromeda. Now, for starters, whilst it had been left adrift and captured after the Battle of Enger's Redoubt over the Dragog Council of Homeworld during the rebellion, it was captured after that. If anyone has the information to get this ship back working, it would have been the collectors, who are this faction librarian. They have the information, they could have the ability, and bring it back online. This ship would have been a massively useful tool. It's kind of like when we're talking about the Venator class Star Destroyer and their abilities and capabilities vis-a-vis what they could have offered the Rebellion in Star Wars. There is a consistent misunderstanding of the capabilities of these ships, and I think that goes back to the Systems Commonwealth itself, because they had a huge amount of firepower and a huge amount of capability, and yet no one seems to really understand how to fully put that to best use. You know, yes, I love the battle group structure, and I love the fact that they have these pre-organized battle groups, but there'd have been part of me which would have gone, yeah, I'll have 4 of those battle groups, I'll have a planetary assault group, and I'll have a heavy battle group. And the heavy battle group would consist of about 5 of these. Maybe more, at least 5 of them. With the escorts, and their purpose would have been to go into the enemy fleet and rip them apart. But no. So the Midian Breach is also lost because, well, she can't be saved. She's been crippled, she's had her artificial intelligence deleted, power generation systems damaged, all sorts of things, and she's destroyed by a point singularity at the reactor core, but Hunt manages to escape. But it's a waste of a ship. And there are others known of. Vanguard, Continuation of Politics, Salient Debate, and the Fires of Orion. They all have their own sort of stories about them, and it's lovely to hear about them. You know, the Salient Debate is destroyed at the Battle of Witchhead, which is one of the major battles in the sort of the war with the Nichians against the rebellion, as is the Vanguard. And the Continuation of Politics. Again, these names, come on. But leaving that to one side, as we've been over, there should have been at least 1,000 of these ships. The fact that there weren't suggests that those battle groups, which are supposedly the backbone of the Commonwealth, well, there either weren't, in which case the battle groups, which are supposedly the backbone of the High Guard and the Commonwealth fleet, just weren't there. No wonder they get defeated. Or they are, and where are they? And this is the point. Once you're dealing with the numbers that they're listing of, this fleet, 150,000 ships. Okay, I'm not being obsessive. I'm overly ambitious. I'm saying about 1,000 of them should have been heavy cruisers of 150,000. So less than 1% of the ships. For a 1 million inhabited place star system. Again, if you're the reality I'm looking at when I look at the High Guard is that there are issues here in that fundamentally 12 centuries of peace, etc., had left. There had even been a referendum about whether or not to disband the High Guard, as no military forces were no longer necessary, as peace had been achieved. If you were limiting yourself to one planet, and you were sure you were the only higher form of life in the entire galaxy, anywhere, space, that is possibly a justifiable and sensible scenario. But how, even in a fictional world, it becomes considered viable to disband your armed forces because peace will reign when you have no idea what's going on out beyond your borders in the vast reaches of space, and if you're only in 3 out of millions, billions, trillions, infinite number of galaxies, you have no idea what's out there. That seems hubristic to me. Anyway, now we reach the Andromeda Ascendant, and she is beautiful. She's also the member of this class we know the best. We know she has 15 habitable decks and 13 uninhabitable decks. We know she spent roughly 320 years in service. She's been upgraded at various points. We know that she carries can carry a lot of systems. But most of all, we know her mission past, and if anything exemplifies a cruiser role, it's this. You know, her first combat mission was head of a task force to repel the Magog, flagship role. In charge of Task Force Bucephalus, and protected the Luwian cluster. She then went on another mission to go and try and find out where the source of the Magog invasions were. She did. This was the time when we finally discovered that the Magog come from a world ship. Again, if there's ever a point at which the response should have been massive world ship. Okay, every heavy cruiser we have, come here. Every destroyer, you know what I'm calling destroyer to stand off attack ships, here. Massive fleet, go. You don't sit and wait for that kind of thing to reach you. You go and take it out now, while it's a long way away. And if you have groups which are specifically worried about it, you then release that information quietly to them and you say, you bring your fleet along, your militias, your home guards. We're looking for volunteers for this mission. Everything's being kept quiet. Throughout the series, we see her, the several seasons. I think it's 5 seasons. Yeah, 5 seasons. You see her pursuing various roles, which are pretty much all cruiser focused. She is incredibly powerful, and we must presume, therefore, all her class are equivalently. The standard missile has a 40 megaton yield and reach speeds of 90 plus PSL, or percentage speed of light, so 90% of speed of light plus. Those missiles also have a mass of roughly a kilogram, which is pretty much the mass of my fist. She can fire 8 missiles per second from each of her 40 electromagnetic launch systems, which give her a total of 19,200 missiles per minute. We can all think of the amount of cruiser captains in World War II who would have liked a rate of fire roughly equivalent to that from their primary guns. Not secondary, not tertiary, not the 20mm Oricon. The primary gun can get out 19,200 missiles per minute. Now, I have just said that Andromeda can fire 8 missiles per second from each of her 40 electromagnetic launch system missile tubes, giving her a total rate of fire of 19,200 missiles per minute. With this kind of firepower, she can depopulate a planet in under 2 minutes. The trouble is, on the stats and everything else listed, she is listed as having 200 electromagnetic launch system missile tubes. And with 200 electromagnetic launch systems, she should have the capacity to launch 96,000 missiles per minute, which, using her own statistics, well, should depopulate a planet in a little over 24 seconds. Ouch. Now, the question is, this all is canon. This stat sheet comes from the same page which these stats come from the same page which has the other written on it. So, my guessing is it's like a modern VLS system. So while she does have 200 missile tubes, she only has 40 assigned to the Strike Arrow surface attack variant. The others are assigned to other missile types. So with the 40 that she has standardly assigned to Strike versus anti-ship missiles and the various anti-ship missiles, she has 40 assigned to ground strike. She has the other 160 are assigned to the anti-ship missiles, which can probably be used in a surface strike. There's an interesting strategic Star Arrow multiple independent kill vehicle, PM6LIA, which is also could be part of the 40 missiles. It's a reality that this is probably the strike load rather than the full missile load, which is interesting again. Because theoretically, doctrinally, she can load all her tubes with this. So standard might be to not always have, well, that's not still enough firepower that you should be able to do that. But also, and this was, the reason I've mentioned Glyn and the reason I'm pointing this out is something which I've been considering, but Glyn pointed out himself, and he's done some maths on this, is that as she weighs 96,400 tons and is 1.3 kilometers long, and yet theoretically, if she's firing all missile tubes, is launching 96,000 missiles per minute, which at 1 kilogram each is 96 tons a minute, which is, well, how do I put this politely? Every 10 minutes, she's firing 1% of her entire mass. This ship is either incredibly lightly constructed or is basically hollow aluminium foil, considering the size. In simple terms, the Glourious Heritage class heavy cruiser is 4.5 times the length, roughly, of a Gerald R. Ford class supercarrier, and yet that weighs 100,000 tons. 100,000 tons. This weighs 96,000 tons. I realize something happens when sci-fi is being organized and when it's being written and prescribed, in that you can have issues turn up, and there are going to be a couple more inserts in this video. They're being recorded slightly out of order. But I think a more realistic figure for the weight of this vessel would be 960,000 tons. Judging by her size, her mass, her capacity, that would be more likely. Especially if you consider the materials she would need to be built from to sustain the firepower and the operation she does, the density of those materials, and therefore the consequent mass. But that's my own little 2 pennies worth added in. She's, with this firepower, unsurprisingly able to depopulate a planet in under 2 minutes. There seems to be a curious lack of examples of them ever actually having been able to use that. But, consistently with the actual missiles and actually being able to use the missiles for operations, this is a significant firepower. Why take up space with Nova bombs, etc., if you're not going to use them? Defense, well, her outer layer consists of the Oracle heavy sensor attack drones and the Janus light sensor attack drones, which are constantly on patrol and capable of sacrificing themselves to take missile hits instead of Andromeda. Next layer is about some of, at least, a cap of drawn from the 76 Type 2 arc light slip fighters. After that, there are 12 50 megawatt point defense lasers, which have a maximum effective range of 75 light seconds. Now, I have to thank Mia Kimura especially for this point, because I have done some rough back of an envelope maths on this, and I'd come up with the coverage of those lasers that are supposed to provide last-ditch sort of missile defense as being below 80%. She very kindly went through my work. She very kindly had her own work, and she explained that her view and maths is actually closer to 76%. Which is, come on! And the battle blades actually make it worse when they're deployed. And I can understand, yes, there is the rule of cool in science fiction. And it's still doing a lot better than any Star Destroyer when it comes to weapons design. I'm sorry, anyone from sitting here going, Star Wars ships are better. They're not. Venator class is up there, but ISD, no. As for the Star Trek ships, we'll leave that to one side. That's going to be a whole nother video. The point is, with the Glourious Heritage class, these are supposed to be your center ships, your task groups, your big ships. I think in my own maths and my own working out, I needed to add in an extra 2, potentially 3 lasers to achieve that 100%. And honestly, that 100% extra 3 lasers was me being me, i.e. somewhat overcautious and probably a little bit more obsessive. The point defense lasers and the anti-proton cannon. The anti-proton cannon, of course, aren't used for the same thing as the point defense lasers, but an extra 3 gets you to 100%. An extra 4, that's allowing multiple lasers to cover multiple axes. And if you want to make my life a real dream, you add in an extra 6 into design. And just watch this ship turn. And ain't no missile getting through. With the rest of the system she already has. The battle blades still are useful. All the other systems are still useful. But you start to realize that with that gap in coverage, suddenly the sacrificial role of the drones and the other systems becomes even more essential, because that's necessary. There's a very real possibility of things leaking through, because not all layers are 100% in coverage. Therefore, you need layers which are going to prepare to sacrifice themselves. But there is a problem with that in combat. You can only do that once. You can't sacrifice yourself multiple times. You're done. You then need to build a new one. And the trouble is, you don't tend to have time to go and mine an asteroid in the middle of a fight. So this is something... The 12 Centuries of Peace keeps showing up again and again in this class, in some of the decisions that have been made for probably very sound technical engineering and reasons, but which are things which should have been found a workaround in order to provide sound tactical and combat capabilities. And after that, she has radiating countermeasure generators. 6 of them, which have a dual purpose of projecting passive and full spectrum active sensor jamming, as well as projecting multiple anti-gravity fields to deflect incoming projectiles off their course if they come too close. They're mounted on the hull, and those are a fairly powerful line of defense. And then she then has a full hull, she has battle blades, all sorts of things to bait this once you get onto the ship itself. She is a very powerful warship. This whole class are incredibly powerful warships. They are worthy of the title of heavy cruisers. And they're incredibly capable, but their use is not. Time and time again, the system's Commonwealth seems to have grown to the point at which it doesn't understand the firepower it's wielding. It's trying to, in many ways, too tightly control the capabilities it has as its purpose. At its purpose, a cruiser is supposed to represent the power and presence of the nation, state, or in this case, starfaring race it represents. That's wonderful. But you also have to be careful with how you build that. If you put on weapons which it's not going to use, which if you have there but no one's going to think you're going to use, then you better not be packing those weapons. If you don't want to use Nova bombs, for example in this case, then don't have them. Because there is no point having a deterrent that you are not going to use, because that means it's no longer a deterrent, it's a joke. These ships were in many ways too powerful for their own users, because they weren't allowed to use them. I do agree with the command structure they set up place. This is one thing they do have, is that it requires 4 officers to authorize the use of these weapons. That's understandable. That's very good. That shows the seriousness. But where's the so you have the security protocols in place, good ones. Why not have the justification for when it would be used? Even if you say in the state in it is last resort, we are forced to evacuate this system and to stop it falling to the, I don't know, let's say an invader of level of the Magog, who are going to do unspeakable, horrid things to any inhabitants they find alive in the system. So those people are pretty much dead whatever happens. Launch an overball. You don't have a guidelines for when it could be used. I think there's also something else which they don't use enough of. And again, I do sometimes wonder whether this is the characters involved that we see versus the realities, but it also seems to be the war they're discussing, because the Systems Commonwealth has Planetfall defense bots. These are my favourite actors in the entire show, and frankly, I feel they should have been in more episodes. There are many ways I could have used them, and would have used them if it had been me. The fact that they have possibly as many as 4,000 mini friends that could also come along with them would suggest that you have a significant landing force capability. Again, not using them is definitely a respect for organic life and a respect for people and higher thinking, but if you're fighting overwhelming opponents and you are not making use of your capabilities, then you're being foolish. I was quite surprised when I first, years ago, started using this as a presentation and using the Glorious Heritage class as a discussion topic, when I found that the Glorious Heritage class, or cruisers like them, were not used as the flagships for the planetary assault groups. They carry a significant landing force, why not? Well, they have their own group, their own ships, which are pretty much not armed in terms of ability to defend themselves in space. You can imagine my thought there. So you're building a ship the same size as a cruiser, and it's going to be pretty much as empty as anything, because it's all going to be for assault. Okay. But that group should have a cruiser with it. That group should be protected. And in the end, you realise very quickly, the whole point is they are protected by a heavy cruiser group, which ties down a heavy cruiser group. And that gives us another lesson, because you have a wonderful strike force. You either have this wonderful strike force that can go in and appear and blast away and disappear, because that's what the heavy cruiser battle groups are designed around. Let's be honest, its main firepower isn't that heavy cruiser, that's the command ship. That's what's there to do the fighting if things get close, and to add its missiles to the attack. But really, it's to slip in, blast away, and then disappear, and then appear somewhere else and blast away from there. They're not supposed to be sort of stuck there to fight. Well, if they're having to escort a drop group, that's what's going to happen. And the thing is, if the drop group has its own heavy cruiser as its command ship, then you could go, right then, well, I'm going to switch my command of my battle group, and I'm going to go and command from one of the destroyers, or I put one of the destroyer captains in charge of the destroyer group, take off my escorts, not the support ships, leave them with the destroyers, and some escorts with the destroyers, tell them to do their running attacks, and take the remainder of the escorts and my heavy cruiser, join the heavy cruiser and the escorts of the drop group. Boom. It's not perfect, but it'll do. This is a well-designed ship. This is a capable ship, and for sci-fi, it's an extremely rounded ship for cruising operations. It's good-looking. It's got all this understated beauty in it, striking looks. I know I keep emphasizing that, but it does matter in these things. It's also got a huge amount of firepower and gardens and things on it. All great things for diplomacy. And it certainly seems to be used for first contact missions and those kinds of exploration missions and to go off and find the Magog world, etc. All good things. But ultimately, if you're using one type of ship for everything, and you're not building enough of them, you're in trouble. And that means ultimately, perhaps the Nietzscheans were right about the system's Commonwealth, that it just wasn't strong enough. Because they could build these really powerful ships, but they didn't build enough of them. They could build these really powerful weapons, but they weren't prepared to use them. They could do a lot of things, but they didn't want to. And so they didn't. And so ultimately, they don't look strong. They look weak. And that is a lesson for this today. When I see people saying, oh, we want to put this weapon on that weapon on a ship, and I go, will you use it? Will you? This is a debate which should have been asked during the Cold War a lot. If you stick a nuclear warhead on a ship, will you allow anyone to use it? If the answer is no, or not without multiple chains of command getting involved, in which case it's pretty much no, because the actual window you can practically fire a cruise missile with a nuclear warhead is going to be very, very small, then don't do it. Don't do it. So, I hope you're enjoying this cruiser series. We are now in March, and, well, I hope you're having fun. Take care, and have a nice day.